We remember the Cold War as a time of stark division, a world split in two, East versus West, communism versus capitalism. We saw the Berlin Wall, a concrete symbol of an unbridgeable gap. We heard the speeches, the threats of nuclear annihilation that echoed from the Kremlin, the threats of nuclear annihilation that echoed from the White House. It was a conflict defined by public fear, a constant low-grade hum of anxiety that shaped generations. But what if the story we were told, the one broadcast on our television screens and printed in our newspapers, was not the complete picture? What if the lines were not as clear as they seemed? It's a disquieting thought. It suggests the history we lived through might have been a carefully constructed narrative, a grand play on a global stage. Behind the public-facing animosity, a different kind of war was being waged. This was a war of shadows, fought not with tanks and bombers, but with secrets and lies. It was a conflict orchestrated in smoke-filled backrooms, executed by men without names. The Central Intelligence Agency, America's own clandestine service, was at the very heart of this hidden war. Their mandate was to protect the nation, but their methods often blurred the lines between defense and deception. They operated in the gray spaces between nations, in the quiet moments between headlines. They pulled strings we never knew existed, manipulating events in ways we are only now beginning to comprehend. The question is, who were they truly fighting? Imagine an iron curtain not made of steel and concrete but of information. A curtain carefully woven with threads of truth, half-truth, and outright fiction. This was the real barrier that separated us from what was actually happening. The CIA became the master weavers of this fabric of perception. They understood that controlling the story was just as powerful as controlling an army. They could create heroes. They could invent villains. They could steer the course of public opinion with a well-placed rumor or a fabricated document. This wasn't just about gathering intelligence, it was about manufacturing reality itself. Ensuring the American public saw the world exactly as the agency wanted them to see it. It was a breathtakingly ambitious project with consequences that still ripple through our world today. Tonight, we pull back that curtain. We will journey into the labyrinth of declassified documents, whistleblower testimonies, historical records that have been gathering dust for decades. We are not just revisiting the past, we are re-examining it. We are looking for the hidden seams in the official story, the points where the narrative frays and the truth begins to peek through. What the CIA hid during those tense decades is more than just a collection of spy stories. It is a shocking revelation about the nature of power and the very reality of the conflict that defined the 20th century. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the Cold War. The term fake Cold War does not suggest that the conflict was entirely imaginary. The nuclear threat was real. The ideological struggle was palpable. The proxy wars fought in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Instead, the concept points to something more insidious. It proposes that key aspects of the conflict were deliberately manufactured, exaggerated, manipulated by intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA. The public-facing rivalry was, at times, a form of grand theater. It was a performance designed to justify certain actions and achieve secret objectives that had little to do with defeating communism. This staged conflict served multiple purposes. It was a powerful tool for social control at home, uniting the American public against a common, terrifying enemy. When people are afraid, they surrender freedoms and support massive military spending. It also provided the perfect cover for the CIA to conduct operations around the globe with little to no oversight. One of the most chilling examples of this manipulation was a program known as Operation Mockingbird. It sounds like something out of a spy novel, but congressional investigations like the Church Committee in the 1970s uncovered startling evidence of its existence. The mission was simple yet profoundly disturbing: to use the media as a tool for propaganda. The CIA secretly recruited hundreds of American journalists, editors, broadcasters. These were not just small-town reporters, they were influential figures at some of the nation's most respected news organizations, including major networks, national magazines. They became assets of the agency, wittingly or unwittingly. These journalists did more than just report the news, they became instruments of U.S. foreign policy. The CIA could ask them to plant fabricated stories in their newspapers to discredit foreign leaders. They could have them suppress information that was damaging to the agency's interests. They could use these media contacts to gather intelligence, or to spread disinformation that would be presented to the American public as objective journalism. The line between news and propaganda was completely erased. The very institutions designed to hold power accountable were secretly working for the most powerful and unaccountable branch of the government. It was a betrayal of public trust on an almost unimaginable scale. The deception went far beyond the media. The CIA's operations on the ground were a masterclass in misdirection. Intricate networks of double agents, secret armies that blurred the lines between friend and foe. One of the most audacious examples was the agency's relationship with high-ranking Nazi officials after World War II. Men who should have been tried for war crimes were instead recruited by American intelligence. The justification was simple. They had valuable knowledge about the Soviet Union. Men like Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence on the Eastern Front, were not just debriefed, they were empowered. The CIA helped Gehlen establish and fund the Gehlen Organization, a West German intelligence agency staffed almost entirely by former Nazi and SS officers. This organization became NATO's eyes and ears in Eastern Europe for years. The problem was these men were not just anti-communist, they were masters of deception trained in the Nazi propaganda machine. It was later discovered the Gehlen organization had been heavily penetrated by Soviet KGB agents from the very beginning. The intelligence the CIA was receiving from its prized Nazi assets was often tainted, manipulated, or outright fabricated by Moscow. The CIA, in its zeal to fight one enemy, had inadvertently hired another. This pattern of using questionable allies created a web of confusion. The agency funded and trained rebel groups around the world, presenting them as freedom fighters battling Soviet oppression. In reality, many of these groups were extremists, drug traffickers, warlords with their own brutal agendas. The most famous example is the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The CIA poured billions into supporting these fighters against the Soviet invasion. The operation was celebrated in the movie Charlie Wilson's War, but the story didn't end when the Soviets left. Many of those same freedom fighters later formed the backbone of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They turned the weapons and training provided by the CIA against the United States itself. These operations reveal a shocking level of short-sightedness, or perhaps a different set of priorities altogether. Was the goal really to promote freedom and democracy? Or was it simply to bleed the Soviet Union, to keep them bogged down in costly conflicts regardless of the long-term consequences? If parts of the Cold War were indeed a performance, then we must ask the most important question: why? What was the ultimate goal of staging or exaggerating a global conflict? Well, the answer lies in the concept of the permanent war economy. The Cold War provided the perfect justification for unprecedented levels of military spending, decades of it. A constant state of emergency ensures that budgets for the military intelligence agencies and defense contractors are never seriously questioned. The fear of the Soviet Union built a vast economic engine embedded in American life. Companies that built bombers, submarines, missiles became some of the most powerful corporations. Towns and cities became dependent on military bases and defense contracts for their survival. This created a political lobby, the military-industrial complex, exactly what Eisenhower warned about. Peace was bad for business. De-escalation meant budget cuts, closures, lost profits, so the threat had to feel constant and existential. Consider the missile gap. In the late 1950s, a panic swept through the United States. The narrative, pushed by politicians and amplified by the media, was that the Soviet Union had a vast and growing lead in intercontinental ballistic missiles. This fear propelled John F. Kennedy into the White House. It fueled a massive expansion of the U.S. military-industrial complex. But declassified documents and period satellite imagery tell a different story. The missile gap was a myth. In fact, the U.S. had a significant nuclear advantage. The fear was deliberately stoked. A phantom menace used to justify new military readiness and tech spending, benefiting powerful interests. This is the core of the fake Cold War thesis, the manipulation of perception for power. The CIA and other government bodies were not merely reacting, they were shaping the narrative. They created a version of the Cold War that was more frightening, more urgent, more black and white. This curated truth was easier to sell to the American people. It provided justification for a global campaign of covert action. The enemy was real, but the story we were told about that enemy was often a carefully crafted fiction. Beyond economics, the Cold War was a pretext for expanding American influence worldwide, a geopolitical blank check. Any action could be justified as fighting communism. The CIA could rationalize overthrowing Iran in 1953 to protect oil, or overthrowing Chile in 1973 to stop a socialist leader. These were often not Soviet satellites, but communist threat made intervention plausible. It became a tool to build an informal American empire, securing resources and friendly regimes. Much of what we've discussed is rarely taught in schools or featured in mainstream documentaries. These are the uncomfortable truths that complicate the simple narrative of American heroism. One such story is the CIA's deep involvement in the global drug trade. The book The Politics of Heroin. Gary Webb's Dark Alliance reporting alleged the agency turned a blind eye and sometimes facilitated narcotics trafficking. Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle Latin America. The Nicaraguan Contras. The logic was chillingly pragmatic. Proxy armies needed money, Congress funding was limited, and overseen drugs became off-the-books cash. While the U.S. publicly waged a war on drugs, one agency allegedly enabled the trade. A final, unsettling thought begins to take shape. What if the primary target of this fake Cold War was not the Soviet Union? What if the elaborate stagecraft? What if the manufactured crises? What if the media manipulation were ultimately aimed inward? What if the real war the CIA was fighting was a war against the American people's ability to know the truth and govern themselves? It's a shocking conclusion, but one that the evidence seems to support. A fearful and misinformed public is a compliant public. The quest to uncover it is more than an academic exercise, it is a civic duty. We must learn to question the stories we are told. Become critical consumers of information. Demand transparency from our institutions. Stay curious. Keep asking questions. Like, share, subscribe. The conversation is just beginning.